Welcome back to A Fork in Town, the Electricity Podcast. Don is joined today by Dylan and Chris. Dylan, say hello.
Hello.
Okay. Chris, say hi to the good people.
Hi, good people.
Okay, that may become Dylan's new thing to say hello. Dylan, we can play with what your thing is, but now we've done the part of getting your voices on the air, and it gets it's an official episode once Chris has said hi to the good people. So we just don't be surprised at all if you're a faithful listener to the podcast. If you just hear an episode that just starts, not in my voice, not anybody else's voice, it's just Chris saying hi to the good people, and we're just going to get straight to it because it's not official until we do that. But I'm glad to have Dylan and Chris join me today. We were just talking off podcast during our prep time on this. I think this is checking the box, if my memory is correct, of the last of the suggested topics that we could have handled on the live stream that didn't win the direct election. So we've gone back and picked all of these up now with this one. So where we're going today is sadly without Alexis's benefit, because normally we are better served by having her benefit when it comes to this. But we're going to that bejeweled isle, often referred to as Britain, and we're going back to a very familiar date in Anglo Western European history, just in general. We're going back to 1066. And what we're going to be pursuing today is a different sort of set of circumstances around what we normally think of as being the Norman conquest, but we're not going to be talking necessarily about the Norman conquest by the time that we're done. So Dylan, I'm going to pass it over to you to sort of set us up and get us rolling here, and then we're going to jump straight into this one that we've already dubbed is going to be not a pebble in the pond, but is probably the big boulder crash when it's all said and done.
Yeah, so we're in September of 1066. 1066 is right up there with 1492, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, as being just kind of one of those years that you know what happens just when people reference the year. 1066 in the real timeline is famous for William the Conqueror, the bastard Duke of Normandy, defeating multiple different kings. This, basically proto Game of Thrones situation we got going on here, to become the King of England and the settler of Norman aristocracy over the Anglo-Saxon peasantry of England, thus developing what we know as the modern English culture and the last about 900 years of what everybody has understood as Western world history. So the short version of what really happened is Edward the Confessor dies in the mid 11th century. Supposedly, he had made some kind of deal with William, Duke of Normandy, that when he died, William would become his heir to the King of England. So that's how William is involved. Harold Godwinson is the one who is put on the throne by the various English barons who obviously don't want a Frenchman, which is what William is, on the throne. And Harold Hardrada is the King of Norway, I believe, who is pressing, a distant dynastic claim, but also a sort of ancestral, Viking claim, based on the old Danelaw in and around York and Northumbria in sort of the northern part of England. So you basically have a three-way fight between these three kings, all of whom are racing to try. Well, Harold, Hardrada, and William are racing to get to England. It's an island. They have to sail there to defeat Harold Godwinson before he gets a chance to consolidate power, and they lose their opportunity to capitalize on this. So in September, I'm looking for the exact date here real quick. On the 25th of September in the real timeline, the Battle of Stamford Bridge takes place. So Harold Godwinson, the English king, hears that the Norwegians are coming, and he races north to beat them. Catches the Norwegians by surprise. Battle of Stamford Bridge happens. Harold beats Harold. No, this is not going to keep being confusing for the rest of the episode. And the Norwegians are defeated. Harold Godwinson, the English king, then rushes all the way back down to fight William of Normandy, whose invasion actually was going to start the same day as Stamford Bridge, but it got delayed by a couple days, so he didn't end up showing up. So you have the English beating the Norwegians, then the exhausted English running all the way down to basically, south of England to fight off the Normans who are invading. And obviously an exhausted army that's just walked several hundred miles, probably not in the best fighting shape, Surprise, surprise, they fall prey to Norman cavalry. And William, then enjoys his brand new kingdom and all of his new cards for the Monopoly board. So the real sort of premise here is, what if William's invasion hadn't been delayed? So he lands on September 25th. If that's the case, Harold Godwinson actually, more reasonably probably could have been expected to march towards him just as the closer adversary, because he needs to deal with the more immediate threat. You've got Essex and Kent, in sort of southeastern England as your primary Anglo-Saxon centers of power, going back hundreds of years. So he needs to protect, his seat more than the stuff that the Vikings have been screwing around with for a couple hundred years by now. They can keep doing that for a while. They've figured out how to deal with that. So in our fork, Harold Godwinson goes after William the Conqueror, who is not the conqueror, just for whatever reason, let's say, without getting into the tactical whys and wherefores. He ends up beating William the Conqueror and then has to do a reverse of what really happened, fast march up to York, and then gets beat by Harold Hardrada. So now we're looking at a Norwegian conquest of England rather than a Norman conquest of England. The Anglo-Saxons, as with the real timeline, have no say in the matter.
Dylan, you did a fantastic job there. An absolutely brilliant job of summarizing something that can get really confusing, I think, really well. I applaud you for that. And it's difficult because, two people decided to be called Harold, which adds just the extra difficulty to that. So this was suggested by one of our listeners. This was not the topic that won our vote for the live stream. So this is why we didn't do it then, but why we're doing it now. So I can think of a lot of ways to start here, but I'm just going to throw it out. Chris, Dylan did the setup there. Chris, do you have any thoughts on that, or maybe a place to launch us off to as a starting point before I do it?
So the one thing I kind of want to talk about a little bit is why everybody is named Harold. These are very closely related groups. We think of the Normans and we talk about Normandy being in France. Those were Vikings. The Normans were Vikings that were basically bought off by the King of France by being given Normandy. So it's really interesting to me right now that they're so similar, and yet we're about to take this a really interesting different place just by switching out which band of Vikings almost wound up taking over England.
I think that's an interesting point, Chris, because I'm glad you raised that, because it's not the first thing that sprang to mind, but I know that it's true. They have that common ancestry, but is it a fair thing to say they had evolved differently because of the reasons they evolved differently, being landed gentry, landed, versus, more the Viking tradition of being seafaring. And yes, they have a common cultural root, but they had really diverged a lot pretty quickly if you think about the way that normally works over time, right?
Right. They really had. Yes.
Yeah. And because the other thing that always fascinates me, because this I'll readily admit, this is one of those areas of, in my formal, training, either in high school or in college, this part of world history was covered, but it gets confusing and there's a lot of nuance. So you get the big picture pretty well, but you don't get down into a lot of the detail often that's here. And what always fascinated me, because it always keeps coming up later, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce it now because it is one of the, I think, the departures here, is that even later when we talk about who is the King of England, the people that are vying for that position, this goes down to the anarchy subsequent to this, other places as well. Yeah, but the primary title they care about, at least for the Normans, are their French titles. And this other thing is sort of an adjunct, extra add-on, from what I understand here, to a degree. Not for everybody, but it varies in such a way that, oh yeah, I'm King of England, but it's more important that I'm Duke of this in
it
France.
Is more important to them, but I'm going to be perfectly honest. I found Dylan's explanation very good, but the cynic in me just sits here and says, "Yeah, there's an open seat. and everybody and their brother, it's musical, it's literally musical chairs. Everybody and their brother is going to come up with a reason that I have a historical claim to X. So, you know, did William have some kind of deal made? Maybe. Did Harold Hardrade have some kind of deal made? Maybe.
But does it matter? No.
No. It's a power vacuum. Period.
Well, and that's why Harold, Hardrada taking over actually, from a strict, military quality of the man perspective, actually makes more sense than William the Conqueror, because Hardrada he's the king of Norway. He's conquered Denmark. He went to the Byzantine Empire and played Varangian and the Black Sea for years. This is like, if you took a stereotypical like 80s death metal album cover Viking, like, Frank Mazzetta classic, like Invader, this is that guy. Like, he is going to terrify a lot of the people who, with a Harold Godwinson or even sort of an unstable, William the Conqueror in foreign territory, might have to think twice about dealing with some people. Harold Hardrada's just, if he even bothers to politic with them or not, he's eventually just going to cut their head off. I think is what helps his position significantly. That, and the fact that, at least a third of England, less than 150 years before, was under the rule of Vikings. So, you have to remember, we're not that historically removed from the sort of heyday of the Viking Age. 1066 is usually regarded as the official end date of it. So, we're completely upsetting our normal understanding of what the Viking Age even is with this fork.
Yeah. And you made a reference to it earlier, Dylan, and for good reason. It often is there. Part of the reason so much of this stuff sounds Game of Thrones-ish is because George R. Martin is borrowing all of these narratives and changing them just enough to be his fictional narrative, but based on a historical thing. I mean, you can argue that, William the Conqueror is no different than Aegon the Conqueror to some degree in the Game of Thrones. It's just, there's no dragons. That's pretty much the difference, and he changes the names. But that's the reason all this stuff echoes, is part of the magic of Martin's writing, and I'll get off the soapbox, is that he picks historical influences in such a way that so that you have that ring that's already there that you can grasp onto, and then he's flipped the narratives around in such a way that they're a little bit unique or different, and then just add dragons.
Yeah, and so I think just, for the sake of convenience, I think, we're probably going to see, assuming Harold, wins and you have a Norwegian king of England, he's probably going to do the same kind of thing that William the Conqueror did, which is hand out, titles to his loyal, military men and sort of hangers on, because Harold is trying to essentially recreate the historic sort of, massive North Sea Viking empire of Canute the Great, from about 100 years before. So you're probably going to see sort of the same political structure where you have, these newly landed nobles of a foreign culture ruling over Anglo-Saxons. What blend does that create is kind of a question. But I think the biggest, most obvious real fork that we have is, you have a British Isles, especially in England, that is much more tied to Scandinavia than it is to the sort of quote unquote continent.
So can I go ahead? I'm going to raise a question. I'm not sure that they do. I think Don was just pointing out how much the Norman nobles like being the Duke of Normandy, like being landed gentry of a they have the feudal structures. They enjoy owning land. Is that true for a Norse, for a Viking structure? Is that something they want, or is that kind of grafting the English feudal model onto their society?
It is to an extent at this point, not as much as you might think, though, because the Viking, Norway there are parts of Scandinavia that are still pagan, but Norway has been, not for a long time, but, extensively Christianized at this point, other than sort of
Mhm.
your sort of, think of them as, pagan survivalist hippie types living in the woods. You don't, most everybody in Norway is Christian.
Yeah.
They're used to sort of the Christian feudal power structures. It's probably not the sort of, chanson de guerre, the Carolingian sort of feudalism that you've got in France and sort of the Low Countries under the sort of Carolingian kings, but it is a version of feudalism. Now, the
Okay.
other thing is, Norwegians are going to like England because it's not
Mhm.
cold-ish. It's cold. It's not as cold. And you can grow things there, which is kind of a novelty for a lot of people from Scandinavia.
So they'll become landed because they can actually
Exactly.
be landed.
Yeah, they may not start off that way, but there's going to be kind of a natural tendency
Okay.
to move that way. It just may be, it may not be quite as sort of romanticized, I guess is the word, as sort of the French style court. It may be, kind of a sort of harder, you know, realpolitik kind of landed gentry. It's going to be sort of much harsher. You're not going to have, sort of all these pretty poems. The Bayeux Tapestry is not going to exist for one thing.
I
But
think
you're going to have.
it would be shorter, but it would exist as
It's
I
actually
understand it.
that's actually yeah, that's a good point. It would be much shorter, I guess. But Snorri Sturluson would be a
Right.
lot longer because he'd have more to write about. So six of one, half a dozen of the other. But yeah, I think there would be at least a version of feudalism.
Okay.
And you've also got to remember, like at some point there is going to be some bleed over from France. It's just not going to be kind of as inundative as it would have been
Is
under a Norman administration.
is question, and I know this is kind of where Don wants us to go, which is the British.
Don has no agenda. Don never has an agenda.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
I just got done talking about how cynical I am. Um, there's the old, the 100 Years' War very much comes out of this of that tie. Is this does this result in the bleed changing direction, in that you don't have French society and structure bleeding over into England, but you've got a Norse power base? As I was just talking about, hey, the Normans were Norse. And do you have just to get back to the cynicism, hey, listen, like William eventually or some Norman is going to die and not leave an heir? Do you have cross channel going the other direction?
That's where that is where I wanted to go, but you didn't know it, Chris. Is to me that's the intriguing part. Is we've now assumed Norse control of we're just going to keep calling it England, even though it's there's the Anglo part of that, the Anglo-Saxon part is still there. They're just under Norse control, not not being not the other way. But part of my question would be: is that first of all, is that enduring? Is this a temporary occupation by the Norse that eventually either indigenous forces arise and throw that off for various reasons that might be there, or a subsequent, William's grandson comes along still claiming that he has a claim to something, and it's just a matter of time before, the continent seeks to influence Britain in that sense, coming from the area, the what we think of as France today. Um, versus the Scandinavian thing. And I don't know the answer to that. I think it does matter because, to your point, Chris, do the Vikings stop? Does the Norse influence stop, or does it keep rolling? I think it keeps rolling. And so then the question is not just what is the long-term change to the history of the island in the big sense of of Great Britain, but what is the long-term change in terms of not just there, but how it bleeds over into continental politics and the continental things that are there. And to Dylan or whoever brought it up, Chris, the 100 Years' War is this constant thing of I'm English, but I'm claiming the throne of France. I'm France, but I'm claiming the throne of England thing that may still exist. Somebody still may try to do that for the reasons we talked about earlier, but there's not as much of a legitimacy to it as there was otherwise.
They come up with some justification.
Yeah, again, you will find, the seventh cousin 6 times removed who's claiming I have a legitimate right to this. They're going to do it and then try to back it by force, as we know. But in a practical sense, I guess is my question back to the idea of real politic here. In a practical sense, do you actually have an enduring Norse imperial presence in the island we call England?
So I think just from a succession standpoint, you have at least a decent shot at it because, just like William the Conqueror ends up having several, at least immediately relatively strong sons who don't, kind of screw the whole system up irreparably, at least in the short term.
There were a lot of qualifiers there.
It's the Middle Ages. If I don't put qualifiers on it, somebody's going to kill somebody with a chicken bone, and then my whole thesis is going to be gone. I got to do what I got to do.
Yeah.
But Harold Hardrada had several sons who actually were king. He has 2 or 3 pretty solid generations who are kings of Norway, who actually, in the real timeline, continued to annoy William the Conqueror and several of his children. So I think you can at least make an argument that assuming personalities and upbringing, kind of stay relatively similar, in the new timeline, that you're at least looking at, maybe 80 or 100 years of Viking sort of rule of England, or at the very least, significant presence, because not only are we looking at in this timeline a Viking king of England, you've got the historic Viking Danelaw, which that's going to probably be Harold's power base, at least culturally speaking, rather than sort of the London area. You also have the Viking rulers in Ireland who have been around and will be around for another, couple hundred years before they're kind of either all gone or sort of merged, as well as, you've got other Viking conquerors who are still fooling around in the Scottish Highlands and sort of the Orkneys and things like that. So all that is to say, at the very least, you're looking at a guy who's got a lot more opportunities for backup if things go south for him, as well as the potential for alliances, or, at some point you figure he's probably going to try some kind of rapprochement with William or one of his kids, at least to try and nip that in the bud to keep them from coming to stab him in the back. So I think at least for 80, 100 years, you've got relative stability and sort of synchronicity or parallelism with our timeline.
And once you've got enough of that you have it lasts for long enough that it makes a difference, in that time frame there. Now you've opened the door for how much downstream of a difference does it make? And I think that then becomes somewhat more substantial because, much of the history that I know we're going to get into here, we're eventually going to get down to, well, I mentioned, I think, the anarchy before. We've done some episodes on that, reminded of it here recently because of something I saw. We're going to get down to Henry, who marries Eleanor. So you bring in the whole Aquitaine, bit of this, and you get, a couple of interesting sons, one that's not so great, that ends up being forced to sign this document called the Magna Carta, and all the stuff that flows off of that. That's not too far down the road. We're 1066, for example, to 1215, just the example that I gave there, is not that far removed. So if it only lasts for 100, 150 years, even if that's how long it lasts, and then something undoes that, you've changed a lot just by having it last that long.
Well, and you have, with 30 years after this, you have something that, really all they have to do is last 30 or 40 years, and then the Crusades start in the 1090s. So you
Right.
have immediately something that detours most of the attention of medium to minor noblemen all across Europe from, people who may have claims in part of the British Isles. Rather than do that, if they think they're going to have more success, trying to fight in the Holy Land and maybe carve out a kingdom for themselves, they're just going to go do that because, hey, they get silk and spices out of it. At the very least, they get some pepper for all that bland medieval food that they get. If they try and conquer England, they have to go fight Vikings and eat mushy peas. No offense to our British listeners. I just don't understand it.
But and the other thing that flows off of that for me is immediately goes to there is when I don't want to go too far down this path because it's a place we could easily get into. But you mentioned the Christianization of Norway, of Scandinavia. It's a different flavor theologically of Christianity than than the Catholic tradition that leads to the Holy Roman Emperor that carries through the Carolingian thing here. And so while you might not have a 100 years war in the sense of, the wars between England and France and contending what's there, you may end up with an earlier version of not the Reformation, but something that is more of a schism inside of what I don't even know if I want to call Scandinavian Christianity Western Christianity as opposed to Eastern Christianity. It's just that you have another flavor called Northern Christianity that sort of now has a power base that you might have a religious element of this that kicks in at some point if you get somebody who really decides that's something they want to pursue and think about.
I like where this goes in terms of tying Britain as a power base to the Nordic power structure, because the thing I want to talk about, the thing going through my mind is there's an entire country today whose literal name comes from these Norsemen. Russia. Russia is literally the land of the Rus, who were another band of Norsemen. And I'm kind of envisioning, I mean, you mentioned Northern, but you have kind of a crown there. You have an upper area almost capping the, call it the Mediterranean Catholic Carolingian world. And if Britain is part of that and almost, helping to extend that arc around the north end of Europe, how does that play out in terms of this structure bleeding into the continent? They're in Denmark. The Low Countries are very threatened by these Norsemen because anywhere that they can access easily, they can raid, especially, think about couple of centuries later with the Anglo-Dutch wars. I mean, if you control England, you can play in the Low Countries. So this offers a really interesting question here for a completely different power structure. Uh, uh, yeah, I think I made that point.
Go ahead, Dylan.
No, please don't.
Yeah.
Well, what I was about to say is that the other part of that to me that I find, you mentioned the Crusades, Dylan. Maybe if you have this concern about a threat from the north, maybe you're not as willing to go off and launch a crusade because that seems a little irresponsible or has a folly to it, given that you're concerned about your northern borders, which while they're not secure, forever in the time of the regular crusades, it's a different scenario that allows you to feel like you can go off and go crusading.
Yeah, or maybe because you already have a series of wars that you could probably call crusades in sort of Eastern Europe, in Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltics, leading up to and sort of finalizing the conversion of what we now know as Russia. But I can kind of see where Chris is going, but at this point, you have to remember that Russia is not a thing, at
Right.
least in our modern conception.
Oh
it
no,
is
it's
still
not. But you mentioned yourself, Hadrada had spent time in the Byzantine Empire.
Yes, and the Byzantine Empire is very much probably more the interesting connection that you kind of think of, because if you have England sort of in a Norse sort of sphere, you now essentially have a arguably more direct connection between Byzantium and England than you do having to go through 9 or 10 continental land powers, because the Vikings can just go straight down the Volga and the Don and a couple other rivers I forget the name of and go straight down there.
Right.
So could be interesting.
Because even in the Crusades, you did have a tension between the Western and the
Oh,
Eastern.
very
Well,
much so.
yes, you know,
Very much so.
especially considering the Fourth Crusade.
Yeah.
Yeah. But by the time you get to Crusade Mark IV, there's a question about who you're actually going over to fight, or at least how it turns out. There's no doubt about that.
Well, and that would be, you know, the when you started talking about Russia, what I kind of started thinking of is, you know, do you have, you know, one, does a Norse sort of occupation of England lead to a relatively more stable sort of Scandinavian kind of northeastern European power structure over the next couple hundred years? Because, you know, when Hardrada dies in our timeline, you know, his sons are kings of Norway, but they kind of do the whole sort of joint rule thing. It gets kind of weird and they fracture after 100, 150 years. Well, what does that start butting up into? That's the Mongols knocking on your door. So, you know, you start to wonder if you have a more consolidated, you know, cohesive, you know, Scandinavia by way of having more stable England under a Norse rule, does that help buttress against the Mongols in Eastern Europe? You know, not sure there's an answer, but it's interesting to think about.
I don't think it does. I mean, the you know the Mongols are horsemen. The Norsemen are basically amphibious, and it just doesn't. I don't see the I don't see
No,
the Norse.
and yeah, I guess I'm not talking about it. I guess I didn't mean to imply, you know, in sort of a head-to-head fight, but
Mhm.
you know, I'm more coming from the perspective of, you know, for a long time in the real timeline, people heard these rumors of Prester John and this sort of mythical Christian king in the East that everybody thought was going to come save them. When it turns out that they were talking about Genghis Khan, who was very much
Okay.
not going to save them.
In
You know,
fact,
I was
we're very lucky that he didn't actually conquer them. That's a whole other thing,
yes,
and
yes.
and a topic we have in our
We've got a
queue
whole
that we
nother
will get
topic
to.
on that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm more thinking from almost a medieval information warfare sort of way where,
Mhm.
you know, at least the Norwegians and the Scandinavians, because obviously they're going to start going into Finland too if they're consolidated. They might be able to spread the sort of real word faster, I guess is more what I'm thinking about. Not that it would stop the Mongols from, you know, at least going after sort of the Kievan Rus and, you know, the sort of like
Mhm.
Ukrainian plateau, but you might see them not get, you know, into the basically the shores of or the front gates of Vienna and sort of
Okay.
into Bohemia, you know,
Mhm.
basically further east from there is
Yeah.
kind of more what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Which what does that then dovetail to into a Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs' backyard in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries?
eventually we're going to get rid of those chins. For so long, Chris and I worked to
Yeah.
avoid a certain war. Dylan, eventually we're going to get rid of the Habsburg chin. We're going to make it happen.
That's going to be like you know, my version of Chris trying to find a way to not have World War II
Yeah.
or Eric killing
Yeah.
presidents. I have to find a way to stop the Habsburg chin.
Ooh.
I'm with you on that. It's a noble
Which,
quest.
interestingly, since we have a Norse England, does that then also affects the power politics of the Iberian Peninsula? Because obviously France is they're not necessarily going to be as focused north. They're going to turn their attention elsewhere. So, you know, you maybe don't have the some of the power dynamics between England and the sort of Jimenez family of Iberian kingdoms that eventually dovetails into the Spanish Habsburg chininity.
We're going to trade. We're going to trademark that term. But the other thing that I don't want to chase this too far, but I'm just going to throw it out there because I'm interested to hear what our listeners want to pop in. Again, we invite our listeners to spend our Discord and other places, sort of give us feedback on this. Reminding here, Chris, you hit it. You described the Vikings as amphibian. They're capable warriors on land, but they're also very capable navigators and seamen, as we well know. But one of the things that's interesting to me to think about is with further intrusion, basically the Viking England concept here, does that become a springboard for more of the voyages westward in terms of expanding out from there, which were already happening? I think you can make, interestingly enough, two contrary arguments there. One is there's less need for Vikings to go west because they can go southwest and to find what they need. That's part of it, because a lot of that was finding to try to find arable land. That's how you end up over in Greenland, and then try to sell it as a marketing stunt by calling it Greenland, even though it's very much not green. But then wayward navigators going in that direction get off course and suddenly find themselves in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and places like that. So I think you can make one argument there's less of an impetus to go west because there's more to go to that's essentially southwest or there. Or you can make the argument, well, once you've established what you do there in Viking England, it's a whole lot easier than to launch off from there, in addition to where you've been launching off from to go towards the New World.
The other thing, to kind of piggyback on the second, I think the second is the more important one. And here's what I'm thinking about. So the reason that Vinland was debatable is that basically the Norse, the Vikings landed in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland area, and they had some settlements, but they had basically fishing villages. They didn't really go inland. I think if you've got a group of Norsemen who like being landed lords, who have an experience developing and settling and building farming communities, I think you can have a settler population of Norsemen in Canada, in the Canadian maritime provinces, and once you've got that toehold, a whole bunch of other stuff is going to come from it. That you might, this is the thing that could lead to a Viking North America. Not even the British Isles as a stepping stone there, but the British Isles as an incubator of a landed nobility that actually knows what to do with arable land or something like that.
Yeah, but I think it's going to be a different occupation of North America than what you would typically think of, just based on our normal understanding. Because, I mean, you're right. Vinland and those sort of suspected Nova Scotian settlements, they're basically just glorified boat repair shops.
Right.
Is really all they are. If you did have more of a Viking presence in North America, what it probably would have been seen as is more of a sort of like a French colonial, is more of what I'm seeing is more resource extraction than colonization. Because if you think about how long it took the Normans, through sort of them becoming the quote unquote English, to really take advantage of the whole of the British Isles. I mean, they not going to wade into a debate over what people's thoughts are on the nature of Irish independence, but they still arguably haven't really done it.
Yeah.
So I don't think the Norse would necessarily have too much of a different experience with that, just in terms of timeline. Like the British Isles are a big place, especially filled with arable land. So, I don't know that there'd be a huge sort of settler colonial kind of territory that we would call Vinland or whatever in Canada. But I think it would be very attractive because England makes a much more convenient stepping stone. I think you would see much more frequent trade. You might even see people starting to go into like the St. Lawrence and down into the Great Lakes.
I agree with you that it wouldn't be the kind of population transfer.
Yeah. But it's not going to be like Spanish or English colonialism.
Well, actually, I think it may be similar to Spanish colonialism.
Oh, you think
in terms of, I mean, thinking about just from a perspective of population transfer, Spanish colonialism is very different than English colonialism. Spanish colonialism is a military force coming over and taking over and creating something with the local population. The British colonial model is literally driving the locals out and completely supplanting them. So I think you would see a blending of, basically what people think happened to the Vinland settlers is they kind of merged into the local population. So I think what you would have in a North America is something similar to what the Normans did, which is, listen, we're on top here. We're gonna almost. I mean, even in the Spanish colonial empire, you very much had like peninsulares and other groups
Yeah, I think
stratified depending upon how directly you could trace your roots back. And I think you would have something similar to that in a Vinland situation where you've got the North, these Norse barons creating a power structure, but not necessarily supplanting the local population.
yeah, so I can see how you would go there. I just think that so much of the Spanish style colonialism is an outgrowth of the sort of Ferdinand and Isabella Reconquista, removal or forcible conversion of the
Mm-hmm.
Muslims and sort of what they had to deal with. I just don't see the Vikings. One, the part of North America that the Vikings are settling in does not have the level of sedentary Native American societies that really allows them to do that to the same extent. I
Initially,
initially, yeah, and I can see
I think
I can see a version of it, but
once
what
they
I'm more
hit like the
envisioning is
St.
like a
Lawrence area, then you're
yeah, then you
really
might start. I'm more envisioning sort of like a almost like a Venetian style network of trade cities
okay.
or trade outposts, not obviously the sort of Italian Republican style, but you could have your sort of Viking, longship barons controlling these sort of nexes of trade points, because then they don't have to really deal with the population who
Mm-hmm.
is probably not going to be super fans of them, and they're probably not going to be super, fans of what they're going to call the scrawls or whatever. Um, they're just going to care about the choke points that they can ship furs, minerals, things like that. Basically like the French. So I think you're going to have kind of this weird combination of like Spanish style military
Mm-hmm.
outpost settlements, but with sort of like a French trading post kind of colony system. It's
Okay.
going to be really weird, I think.
But
But what
my
is
point is, though,
definitely
it's
the
going to.
case. Definitely the case either way, though, is you're not going to have this concept of we had no idea this
Yeah.
landmass was over
Yeah,
there
that
kind
was
of
what I was
thing.
going to say is I think you may see some of the other players start showing up a little earlier because they know about it more.
But I think the main point here is when they do touch down, they're going to spread more. They're going to spread throughout North America, I think, or at least into further into the maritime areas because it's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
just such a
I'll
light
very much give
touch.
you that. I don't know how much pure inland we can expect them to go, but I do definitely think you'll see, you could even start seeing them go on some of the other rivers because you can, portage longboats to a limited degree. You can maybe start seeing them on the Mississippi, the upper Mississippi or
Mhm.
the Missouri, depending, yeah, I think the maritime settlements are pretty reasonable. The inland, like you're not going to see a Viking in the middle of, West Virginia. Let me put it that way. I don't think.
It's again. I know I took us in that direction, but I wanted to just because well, I did a solo episode on that before, about this Norse idea in America, which has always been fascinating to me. But again, this idea very similar to what Dylan, you and I talked about a couple episodes ago about how you alter something like the Reconquista and the timing of it and how it as you slide into the age of exploration, how that changes because of the timing there and the motivations for the exploration and who's doing the exploration, and then ultimately the exploration leading into the exploitation and what does the exploitation look like. You have this chance of starting, in my opinion, this age of exploration earlier, no doubt, and then as what we've been talking about here is what does that form of exploitation, to the extent it's exploitation, look like, right? In terms of what's there, and is it I think it definitely has less of the religious fervor aspect of it, the conversion aspect, than what we know from the Spanish experience that we talked about not that long ago. We even talked about how that would be different, Portugal versus Spain in that episode. We talked about that. But, you saw a very different thing in the real timeline with England. I think you see a very different thing with a Norse influence there. But just it starting earlier changes things, I think, in very interesting ways. And then, of course, the question is, do you still kill off most of the indigenous North American population by bringing over, various things that their immune systems are not prepared for? So do you just do that in a different way with a slower spread, but you still do it? You still have the decimation of North American indigenous peoples through European diseases. It just starts earlier and comes from a different source, kind of deal.
Hmm.
So
I think it's interesting that in our timeline that wasn't kicked off by the Norse, kind of getting back to the guns, germs, and steel argument, almost because they weren't an agricultural population that really lived in close proximity to those draft animals and the microbes to which they were exposed. If you have a Norse population that settled in England, maybe that does actually one. The question is the Norse population now exposed to these?
Well, or maybe does the disease proliferation not become quite as severe because just from a sort of economics of travel perspective, you don't have to have these huge ships that have to
Right.
go,
Right.
in a one shot from Spain or France or England. You can sort of skip to Iceland, to Greenland, to Nova Scotia.
Mhm.
Not saying that's a really fun open seas adventure, but I mean, you can do it in a smaller boat that's not going to be, such tight quarters. Your potential for the sort of really severe proliferation of disease honestly may be kind of mitigated, at least to some extent.
Because to me, one of the other, huge grand scale what ifs is, there's more and more evidence now, as I've understood it, the things I've read. I tend to believe that this is true. We've drastically underestimated the impact of pathogens in the conquest of the New World, and the fact that it had sort of happened before a lot of folks show up. Definitely, it happens when they do show up, but it sort of always happened before. This idea that when the English and the Dutch land where they land, that it's this pristine, unoccupied territory, and that's because over the 100 years right before that, most of those folks have been wiped out through various forms of casual contact that had come down to. So, this had already taken place. You had pre-invaded with pathogens in such a way that you had this different impression of, it's this pristine land that God has just put here for us, kind of thing to come and take. That wasn't the case maybe 100, 200 years before, or of the time that we're talking about once you get far enough in, again, going down the St. Lawrence, working through the Great Lake area. The interesting thing to me there suddenly was you start heading down the Mississippi and the explanation goes north to south, becomes a very different thing than the way that we typically think of that working up, with LaSalle, I guess, who does that. I'm trying to remember which explorer. He's the confused explorer.
Yeah.
DeSoto, yeah. That happened from the other direction. So probably need to draw this down to a close because we could keep going around. But it's interesting because I think, again, we didn't talk about specifics here per se. We knew that sort of going in. This was going to be the big boulder versus the small pebble thing. But 3 days matters. Is that sort of what we come to the conclusion here? 3 days and the order, not the order, but the sequence of battle could be really, really big here if you really carry this to its ultimate extremes.
Yeah, and I do think, and this is kind of a weird sort of final thought, but in our culture, I think we may not have the sort of, some of the Vikingness of the Vikings in our cultural understanding may not be there because you hear the stories of like the Viking berserker, this sort of behemoth warrior who can't be stopped. A lot of that comes from Stamford Bridge. Harold Hardrada's sort of last, line of defense was, yeah. He literally had just a giant hairy dude with an axe stand on the bridge, and he stopped the Anglo-Saxon army for like 4 hours by himself or something like that. I mean, a lot of that mythos comes from this. So you don't have this sort of wild, furious, crazy Viking image. Maybe we just imagine them as sort of, different versions of the French Normans.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you brought that up, Dylan. I think we have this weird conflagrated understanding of, we say Viking. What you just said, we get this the mental images of that berserker-esque thing, and there's no doubt that they in the raids that were conducted, on the coastal occupied territory, and then, there's no doubt that they were a fierce, sort of you know piratish warlike thing. But this idea we have this idea when we say Viking that I think is not a true representation of a lot of what quote unquote Viking culture was. So we have this, almost caricature of Vikings, I guess would be the way I would best describe it. That it's easy to play that in. Well, that's what, yes, they were that, but that's not all they were, kind of thing. And so we forget, the other elements that are less, well, to borrow the Game of Thrones reference, that there's one of the major kingdoms in the Game of Thrones that's more or less based on the Vikings. The Greyjoys. Is sort of this is sort of Martin's version of Vikings, right?
Yep.
I'm just reminded as I'm thinking about that, I'm looking across my bookshelf here, which has some of those books on it. If you know a lot of history and you just know how to repackage it and change, do a little Mad Libs version of changing the names, it's amazing. It can make you a lot of money, apparently. The thing.
Yeah, you don't
I
even have
think
to change the names that hard. You just go from Lancaster to Lannister, and and you're done.
And you go from
Stark York to
York,
Stark.
yeah, exactly. And Targaryen becomes a Tudor sort of a reference in a way, when it's all said and done. Yeah, I'm actually reminded, Dylan and you and I did an episode, ironically, on Egypt, but we ended up naming that episode, Targaryens with different hair, kind of thing, because again of the influence that there. So George is messing our history up for his own profit at the end of the day. Chris, any closing thoughts from you?
No, nothing particular.
All right. Enjoyed this one, guys. This was a good suggestion. Again, one that we didn't take on the live stream. Would have been interesting to see if this had been the one that we had taken on the live stream. But I think it's a worthy one to think of. And of course, we're absent Alexis, who would have really enjoyed a 1066 episode to some degree. So I will specifically ask her to weigh in on the Discord with her thoughts, because I want to hear what she has to say about this. All right, guys, I'm going to close this out as we normally do, reminding all of our good listeners that we encourage you to visit the website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. I know we hype this a lot, but we really enjoy interacting with our listeners on the Discord channel. I want more and more of our listeners to go to our Discord server and interact with us there, because it's a fun place to be. One of the things that we do with each episode is we put a place there for episode feedback. So we want to hear back from you. What do we get right? What do we get wrong here? We want to engage in that. And then our intent is, and we'll have the first one of these coming up before too much longer, is to circle back around with our feedback episodes where we actually go to that content, read it back, talk about it as a team, get challenged by it. We try to debunk it back, but basically we're trying to do a very difficult thing. We're trying to take a one-way audio medium here and turn it into a dialogue. We get that we're swimming upstream when we do that, but to the extent that we've been able to accomplish that, we really enjoy interacting with our listeners there and getting to know their personalities as well, which is one of the things I've enjoyed. That I don't just know them as a name now; I sort of know them as a personality, which is sort of cool, and hopefully the back. So we encourage you to go and do that. We'll encourage you that if you do enjoy the shows and you're able to do so, these will always be free. We intend them to be free, but you do have the option of becoming a Patreon on our Patreon. Links in the show notes for that. One of the perks of that is early access to episodes, and we've done a much better job of building our inventory, so that comes along. We probably are going to have even enough inventory here at some point. We may even pop the exclusive that stays over for patrons only at some point again, if it's something that's outside the mainstream there. Just going there, and also just a very cool thing. I think I mentioned this before, but I feel obliged to do it again. One of our listeners sent us a picture of he and his girlfriend in their Fork in Time shirts. I believe they're some of our good folks that are from down under, if I remember correctly. So it was good to see that there. So if you thought to yourself, the thing I need most of all is a Fork in Time mug or a tumbler or a shirt, other stuff like that, check out the merchandise store, including our Inspired By series. We were just talking off podcast about some of the other Inspired Bys that may be coming along here pretty soon, something to go with from there. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out as we normally do. Our suggestion always to our listeners, when we appreciate you very much, is if you happen upon a Fork in Time, our suggestion is to take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.